Okay, Jamie, what is your second tip you got for us today?
Okay, tip number 2 is turn down the negativity radio. And my argument with this is that basically as teachers, the kind of internal radio that we've got going on in our minds is remarkably kind of insistent, it's remarkably loud. There's such a lot going on there. And it connects a little bit back to what we've said already about the kind of complexity of teaching and also the sort of interpersonal demands of teaching. And also the brutal reality is, no matter how brilliant a day you're having as a teacher, there will be inevitably kind of crap underneath that stuff. You know, there's going to be lessons where things don't fly as much as you want it to. There'll be an email you'll get from someone that will spark off that negativity radio, and then it becomes really, really difficult to switch that radio off, as it were, and you're constantly in a loop of overthinking about things, catastrophizing about things, and internal reflections. And a lot of that's entirely natural, you know, the kind of cognitive biases that we have, the evolutionary stuff, the negativity bias. We're much more inclined to look at things through a negative lens. And the reason I think it's essential that we kind of turn that down, to stretch this analogy pretty far, is thinking about what young people want in a classroom and who young people want to spend time with in a classroom. And for me, young people want people who are passionate, who are enthusiastic, who are positive. So how do we turn down that kind of negativity bias and that negativity radio to give us that sense of joy you talked about in the classroom? And I'm really interested in kind of positive psychology. You talk about books that you get lost in and kind of transformed by, and I've gone many book journeys down positive psychology and thinking about, you know, this kind of reinvention of psychology. So psychology obviously was much more concerned with that, stopping that negativity stuff. But Martin Seligman, the father of kind of positive psychology, came along and wanted to reflect on how we can supercharge the positive. And for me, you know, how can you think more positively? It can get a little bit cheesy because a lot of it's this stuff like, you know, like these gratitude practices where you write down things you are grateful for. But for me, it's actually really, really simple. And I'll use kind of how I speak to my son. So my son's 4, and the last thing I say to him every single day is just what was your favourite thing about today? What was the best bit of your day? And he talks for a couple of minutes about what he's really enjoyed about the day, and then I talk for a couple of minutes about what I've enjoyed from the day. And that's me indoctrinating him through this positive psychology lens. And he gets very upset if I forget. He's like, "Daddy, positives." And I think it's actually something that as teachers we need to be applying a little bit more of. You know, just kind of giving yourself the space to think about, like, what have I done brilliantly today? Because there will be things that you've done brilliantly. And it might feel remarkably artificial at first to say, you know, "Oh, that lesson with Year A was, you know, they absolutely loved it." Or that conversation with that pupil, I dealt with that really, really well. And it's not often we have that internal dialogue where we are ramping up the positive. It's more often, as I say, inclined towards the negative. So I think you have to find a way in which it works naturally for you. There's this book, I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically the whole concept is you say I love you to yourself in the mirror. And it's utterly ludicrous. Nobody can pull it off. But there's a whole book stretched on this. But you're thinking, what can I do to help me feel positive about being a classroom teacher? What can I supercharge and amp up a little bit? And it's finding people to do it with as well. You know, instead of sitting in the staff room and us all harping on about how terrible teenagers are, how can we be positive and how can we reflect on it in a positive way? If that makes
I love
sense. Sorry,
this.
I'm rambling, Craig. I'm rambling.
No, I love this one. So just a couple of my personal reflection on this. I'm terrible for this, Jamie. I always focus on the negatives. So when I was teaching full time, it would hit me in two different ways. So first, I would have real negative thoughts about what was coming up. So if I had a real ropey class, who were particularly ropey in Thursday afternoons, I remember a certain year 10 class, I used to, from almost the minute I finished teaching them on that Thursday afternoon, I'd be dreading in 7 days' time when I'd have to do it all again. And it would, honestly, Jay, it would cloud my thoughts. I couldn't enjoy myself the rest of this. Maybe I'd enjoy myself a little bit on the Friday because it felt further enough away, but as soon as Monday came along, I was thinking, not them again, it's going to come before I know it. And it would affect everything. So I preempted, I always had negativity for something that was coming up. But then exactly what you said as well, even if I had a great day where loads of things went well, the only thing I would focus on is a bad lesson or a bad conversation I'd had with a colleague and something. It's terrible, isn't it? And it seems to be a natural human disposition to focus on that. And for certain types of people, and I think the majority of people, to focus on the negative. And it's hard to break it, isn't it? It seems to happen a lot.
It is. It's really, really tough to break it. And because, the best teachers, the ones who are really committed to it and want to improve all the time, are total perfectionists. Total perfectionists. And I think, to very, very similarly, when I eventually left my bizarre school in central London, which I'm not naming, I'll not get political on your podcast, Craig, but I moved to the northeast and I went to a fantastic school. It was brilliant. But I bought all of that stuff that I had in that kind of toxic environment, that negativity bias, that perfectionism that I'd supercharged. I took that with me to this new environment. And I was totally wired for the first couple of years. I couldn't escape from that mindset of real negativity that was drilled into me. And I was getting eaten alive in the classroom as well. You sort of go from thinking you're fantastic into a different setting, and you're not. And I was getting eaten alive, and it was a disaster. And it was only when that I sort of started a blog actually that was very cheesily titled Teacher Gratitude, and I was trying to be as explicit as possible in that blog about naming things that I felt positive about. So my first blog was absolutely horrendous. I think 2 people read it. It was called The Joys of English Teaching, and it just listed all the things I loved about English teaching. But very, very slowly, the more you do it, the more you incline towards the positive, the more you start to feel a bit more positive, and you bring that into your work environment. But it's a really tough battle, and I completely appreciate that. It's a challenging thing to do.
Oh, it is. A few more things on this, James. So it fascinates me this area. So the first thing I always think about teaching is it's one of the jobs where kind of your success or failure is in the hands of a lot of different people about how you feel throughout the day. Like if you teach 5 lessons in a day, you've 30 kids in each, there's kind of 150 people who can impact how you feel and how you feel the day's gone and so on and so forth. And a lot of that is within your control. Obviously you can do certain things to give the kids better chances of learning and feeling successful and behaviour expectations. But at the end of the day, if you're dealing with 150 people, and those people are adolescent teenagers with hormones flying around all over the show, it's about, I think for me anyway, it was about realising that, a lot of the things are out of my control. And if something's happened in a child's life or in the playground or whatever, there's not a great deal I can do about it. And I've just got to be careful how that it kind of impacts on my mood and how I take responsibility for it and so on. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, and I'm really interested about this notion of kind of the gratitude and the saying it out loud versus kind of writing it down. Because I've dabbled with the journaling. You hear all the top performers, they love a journal. Mm-hmm. And I've downloaded every journaling app on my iPad, on the phone and so on. And a classic one will be to name 3 things that's happened today that you're grateful for, 3 things you're going to do tomorrow, how you're going to be, what could you have done better in the day, all these kind of things. Do you find personally that writing it down helps more, or do you think, I really like this idea of you having this conversation with your son, do you think it's important to kind of say these things out loud? What's worked for you in terms of making explicit how you feel about the positive things that have happened in the day, if that makes sense?
Great question. First, just to comment on your first point about, taking individual ownership of yourself in a school setting. And I think it's a fantastic point. It's so interesting And it kind of relates back to the whole Stoical philosophy idea. You know, this idea that you are the captain of your own ship, to be very, very cheesy. And I think it's a fantastic way for teachers to reflect on how they are in the classroom, because there are so many extraneous factors that are going to influence your day and your success of your lesson. But if you go in with that mentality of your kind of vision of who you want to be and how you want to be that in the classroom, then that's a really empowering way to be, I think. So just a comment on that, I thought it was a great point. The second one about, you know, do you write it? Do you say it? I think, again, one of the great things about kind of teachers is we're all remarkably different and remarkably complex human beings. And I think what works for me might not necessarily work for other people. But I think for me, a balance of two works really, really effectively. And there's a great one. I can't remember where I read this, but actually just I suppose it's linked to what I do with my wee boy. But the last thing you do at night before you drift off into the ether is just actually maybe internally a couple, 2-3 things that you're grateful for, or you feel positive about, or that you recognise are good about your professional world and your private world, isn't it? Because they're not distinct. If you're not happy in the private world, you're not going to be happy in the professional world. So it's a kind of, to be very cheesy and rambly, it's a combination of both, isn't it? So I think it's finding what works for you as an individual is so important. Finding how you can supercharge that positivity in your life.
I love it. Final point on this. I could talk to you about this all day, Jamie, but the last point from me. I think the other thing that I've come to realise is if you're kind of negative yourself, obviously it's going to make you feel bad. It's probably going to make you not be good for your kids, your pupils that you're teaching as well. That's going to come across. But the other thing is, particularly if you're in a position of responsibility, it can really then spread amongst the staff, right? Like if you're a head of department, or you're got a responsibility in the department, you're working closely with some less experienced teachers, and all of a sudden you're saying, oh God, that was a terrible lesson, and oh, I'm dreading this, and oh, we've got all this work to do, and so on. It's not good for anybody else, and there's almost kind of a responsibility as a leader to be positive, right, and to try and find the positives within the kind of mundane or the tricky situations and so on, because you've got that duty to the colleagues that you're working with who look up to you, if that makes sense.
Oh, definitely. I think that's such an important point, because it is like osmosis, and your leaders are so essential in terms of walking the talk, and in terms of creating the climate of a department or a school. And it's really, if you think of anyone who's been your kind of role model within a school setting, the person who you've looked up to, they always ooze that kind of that passion, that enthusiasm, that positivity for what they do and how they do it with young people. And the converse is also true. You think of anyone, you think, oh Jesus, you know, you're diving into the classroom to avoid. It's because they drain you, literally drain you. So surrounding yourself by those positive people and those positive conversations is one of the ways in which you can become that little bit more positive yourself, isn't it? We all rub off each other, I think, in that respect.
Okay.